Fire Department Pension Fund Investment Meeting. Today is 12/13. It is 15. It is
1/15/14 birthday.
It is 20 minutes after 10 with the New York City Controller's Office, 1 Center Street, room 1117, New York, New York. We're going to have the roll call of trustees. And, Janice Emery.
Here.
Controller's Office.
Here.
Mr. Springer. Justin Holt.
Here.
Steve Cassidy.
James Levin is Steve Cassidy's proxy.
James Levin.
I'm here.
Robert Straub.
Here.
John Kelly.
Here.
Jane McGowan.
Here.
John Farina.
Here.
James Lamonda.
Present.
Sean O'Connor.
Here.
Okay, and Doug White. I kept my own votes. I don't usually do the roll call. But anyway, 24 votes. We have a quorum, and we can start the meeting. But the first item on the agenda is the controller would like to address us for a moment. I would just like to say, I knew him a long, long time ago. I don't even remember how long. But a Democratic club was in my building, actually 150 West 96th Street, and everybody votes in that building. So I used to see him coming to the meetings all the time. Anyway, and we have other relationships. But I think that it's important that we now have 2 West Siders who are in power. Okay, all right. So with that, Scott?
Thank you very much. Well, I want to say I'm very excited to be before all of you, and I'm actually very humbled by the process that got me here, and I'm very honored to be here with all of you. Some of you I've known for a very long time. I've always admired Doug White, much older than me. Always looked up to him. No, he's going to throw me out of here. And many of you I've gotten to know, and the one thing I know about the people around this table, you've always worked very hard to make sure that there is a real retirement security for the people you represent. And I know all of you as trustees have enormous pressure and responsibility to do the right thing by the folks you represent. And the job of the controller is to work collaboratively and collectively with the trustees to form a real partnership, to work on the issues that we know we have to accomplish together. And I just want you to know that I'm going to work very hard to meet these challenges. And I want you to feel that you can call on me. It's an amazing fund, right? We have 5 boards, 58 trustees, people who come from all different walks of life. But again, at the end of the day, it's protecting retirement security and growing the fund and hitting our actuarial targets. And I can tell you that we're going to continue to build the capacity of the Controller's Office. I'm very pleased that Seema is staying with us for at least 6 months. She's agreed to help us through the transition. We've enjoyed working with her already. Think about the first 2 weeks of the Controller's Office. We still have money in the bank. The pension fund is growing. And so I'm feeling very secure in that relationship. I also want to thank Thad in particular. From the day I took office, he has been the consummate team player. He immediately went about making sure that we had all the information we needed, all the transition information. He's been a great guide and advisor in his present capacity, but he is going on to advance his career. So it's a big loss for the Controller's Office. But the good news is someone who's worked with me for many, many years, one of my most trusted advisors, somebody who was our Director of Budget and Grants in the Controller's Office, managing tens of millions of dollars in public money. I want to introduce Thad's successor, Susanna Vickers, who's going to work very hard, and I want you to welcome her to this role. But I think you're going to find her to be someone who's very honest, someone who's a straight shooter, and somebody who has direct access to me. And we, based on our, I won't even say how long we've worked together. She likes to say it. She started with me when she was 14. But we've worked very closely together. So, Doug, I just want to say thank you. I welcome you to this great building. There will be improvements made to the physical plant here. That I will promise you, if it's the last thing I accomplish. But I'm really looking forward to the next few years working with all of you, and I hope that we can really accomplish some great things. So I'll leave you to the agenda, and again, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Okay. So I guess the first item, we will start with the public agenda, and I guess, Seema?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. So everybody should have the monthly performance review in front of them. So I will just, a few moments, apologize for the way the state of this package is right now. State Street, our new custodian, we're still in transition with them. I mean, money's transitioned, but we're still trying to get the reporting done on time, properly, and we're making good progress. But so that's why you see it in the state that it's in right now. But next month, it'll be in much better shape. So I thought, given that we have Goldman Sachs here to talk about the economy, talk about what happened in 2013, what to expect in 2014 and in the future, that I'll skip through the economic slides and we'll go right to talk about November, which seems like a long time ago. So we'll go through it quickly, but they're good numbers. So if you turn to page 27, this shows how we did in November across the major asset classes. So the Russell 3000 in November was up 2.9%. EFA was up about 80 basis points. Emerging markets down about 1.5%. Core plus 5 down about 60 basis points. High yield up about 30 basis points. And tips down about 1.2%. So that turns out to be a good November. We'll go through the details. If you turn to the next page, 28, this is December. And again, I'll go through the same categories. So Russell 3000 up 2.64%. EFA up 1.5%. Emerging markets down 1.4%. Core plus 5 down 60 basis points. High yield up 46 basis points. And tips down 1.5%. So we put that all together. If you would turn to page 30, this shows our contribution to return for fire, and this is the month of November. So if you look in the far left bar, the 1 month return for fire is up 95 basis points. Then if you go over a couple columns, fiscal year to date, the total fund is up a little over 9%. And if you add in the December numbers that we just went through, which would add up to roughly about another 1%, the fire pension fund fiscal year to date through December 31 is up a little over 10%, which is great. It's a great number. If you then turn to the next page, 31, this is how we're set up. And again, this is back in November, so November 30th. So you might remember that during that month, we had taken advantage of the strong stock market. And as you can see in the green bar to the left, down below, that we were above the range in U.S. equities, and then we were below the range in Core Plus 5, which is the blue bar to the right. So what we did was we sold down some U.S. equities, and we reallocated that money and rebalanced into Core Plus 5, and specifically within investment-grade credit. And so that was a nice move for us to do at the right time, we thought, for the rebalance. So now we're back in the range, which is good. The next few pages are basically things you've seen in the prior packet, which just goes through some more detail about the asset allocation. And then behind, you'll see the cash flows for private equity and real estate. And next time, the next meeting, we'll have all the manager by manager performance pages to add to this. But I do want to make one comment about where FIRE is in terms of assets under management, because it's a new first time ever. So as of January 10th, 2014, I can tell you that the Fire Pension Fund is now at $10.1 billion, which again, I believe is the first time ever for the fire fund. So it's a great number. We'll try to keep it up. And if there aren't any other questions, we'd like to bring in Goldman Sachs, who's waiting outside.
Okay.
Good? Okay. Yeah, please.
I'd like to make a correction on the record. Notwithstanding, it occurred to me that I'm still in December, and I apparently gave that date, a December date, as opposed to 1/15/14. But the reporter had made it okay anyway. So I was sitting here saying, didn't I say December? Yes. Well, hey, what can I tell you?
I can slide out. I can sit here.
We can, how many are there? Two. All right, we can make room.
Sit here. Justin.
I'll sit right over here. It's fine.
No, Justin can move here.
Yeah, all right, we can slide down.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is good.
Thank you very much.
We have
Good morning, Happy New Year.
Good morning, same to you.
See you.
Yes, thank you.
But would you repeat your names to our stenographer?
Hi, my name is Troy Thornton, Thornton.
And my name is Jose Ursua, Ursua.
Okay.
Good. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Happy New Year. We were asked to deliver a global macro outlook for 2014, and so what I did was I reached out to a different division altogether. I work in the asset management division, so we manage money for clients. We manage money for New York City. Thank you very much, and we're excited to do so. But we also do a lot of research in another side of our firm called Global Investment Research. And so in Global Investment Research, or GIR as we call it, all they do is research. They don't manage money, there's nothing, they don't have client relationships, so on and so forth. Their responsibility is knowing what's going on around the world and publishing a lot of their views. And so today's presentation that you have in front of you is the 2014 Outlook coming from Jose's group. And so just I'll give you a little bit of background on Jose, and then I'll hand it over to Jose. I understand we have about 30 minutes or so for the presentation, but I think that Jose would love for you to interrupt him at any point. But by background, Jose Ursua is an economist within the Global Macro and Markets Group in Global Investment Research for Goldman Sachs. He has contributed to his team's work on a wide range of topics in macroeconomics and asset pricing. Jose received a PhD and a master's in economics from Harvard University. His research has been published in top academic journals and discussed at forums around the world. He also holds a BA in economics and a BA in law from ITAM, his university in Mexico. And you can break down the acronym for anybody that wants it broken down. Where he also worked at the Ministry of Finance, and he also worked at the Central Bank. So he's a very qualified macro economist, and you should feel free to ask him anything that may be on your mind.
Well, thanks again. There's nothing that interesting in that bio. I think the other things that I would actually highlight are that I once escaped from Alcatraz. So I like triathlons, and there's a triathlon that one swims out of the island of Alcatraz onto the bay. Yeah. And I also own jellyfish as pets. I think that's more interesting than what you just received.
Wow.
Thank you very much for the chance to be here. Thanks to Troy and thanks to everyone else. As Troy said, I'm an economist. I basically cover global econ, which means that we do cross-assets and cross-regional research. It's a fun seat because we get to write a lot about anything we like is going on in the world economy, and we try to highlight stuff that we think matters most for the clients. So we're jumping right into it, and please, as George said, please interrupt us as often as you can. Let's make this interactive. I understand we have 30 minutes. I'd be happy to stay more if you guys would like. But targeting those 30 minutes, just ask anything that I could try to answer or discuss. The first page of the presentation, if you please move on to it, is page 3, cash or forecasts. As you know, economists, we spent half of our time coming up with these numbers and then half of our time explaining why they didn't materialize. We tried that to be the least frequent case, but it sometimes happens. Still, in our view of the world, I guess if we start from bottom up, we have a forecast for this year of 3.7%. It's a relatively important pickup from last year's growth, which was at 2.9%. This recovery is coming from various places. Moving on to the first row, that's a U.S. economy, which accounts for close to 25% of global output. There's a big rebound in growth that's going from 1.9% this year to 3.3% next year. It's more than a story of 2014. It's a story of a recovery that's expectedly going to last something in between 2 or 3 years of growth that's going to be above trend. We still think that growth in the U.S., trend growth, should be at close to 2.3%. In the old days, it used to be 2.5. It's only natural that after the crisis, it might have declined a bit because there are some persistent effects from the crisis, but 2.3 is reasonable. And what we're looking at from 2014 onwards is 3 years of very solid above-trend growth. Now, that comes on the back of 5 very bad years of below-trend growth that we have referred to as a great stagnation, or a period of very, very zombie-like growth over the past 5 years, but fortunately we're almost out of the woods in that sense. Some economic optimism is felt in high-frequency indicators. Today, for example, in the morning, we got the Empire Manufacturing Index, which showed very good numbers above consensus expectations. So people are warming up to the idea that 2014 is going to be a year of recovery. I'll go in the presentation through some of the reasons why we think that's the case in the U.S., because I understand that many of you are particularly interested in the U.S., but I'll also discuss some other aspects of the global economy, especially Europe, Japan, and emerging markets. As a summary for those guys, we have there in the table other forecasts. Japan is also been growing relatively quickly with respect to its potential. Japan last year grew by 1.7%. This year we're expecting a 1.4%. That's a lot for the Japanese economy because of their demographic structure. Their potential growth is lower than that. It should get closer to 1%. The euro area is finally moving out of a recession. A recession in technical terms is anything that's below 0% growth. Unfortunately, this year they're moving from to 1.1% from the previous year's minus 0.4%. But of course, there's a lot of divergence under the hood of the European machinery. I don't know if you'd like to call Europe a former Ferrari that turned into a Fiat, or it's an economy that's gone into trouble for various reasons, and there's a lot of heterogeneity across countries. While you have Germany growing at 2% this year and France at 0.7%, both Italy and Spain are at close to 0.5%. So that's relatively low growth. It's a big upgrade in growth for both Spain and Italy from the previous growth rates of below 1% contraction, but it's still not stellar. And I guess the bad news for Europe is that they still need to go through a lot of adjustments that they haven't gone through, and these adjustments are going to be difficult to put in place as time goes by. The UK is roughly in between. Just as it is geographically, it's also in between the forecasts. We're expecting it to grow 3% this year. Canada is at 2%. On the side of emerging markets, as you know, every Goldman presentation has to have the BRIC countries because of Jim O'Neill, who used to be the head of research, then moved on to GSAM as a chairman, and now has left the firm. But he came up with the term BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And because I'm Mexican, I always add Mexico in the presentation. So I think I have the right to do that because I came up with the table. And
Author's discretion.
Author's discretion, that's right. But also because in our projections, Mexico is becoming, I'd say, the fifth BRIC, judged by the size of the economy all the way to 2050. Of course, you can claim that those projections to 2050 have more of a magic than science, and it may be true, but as far as one can tell, based on demographic trends and other factors that one can control for long-run growth, we think that it's going to become the fifth largest economy. So on the emerging market side. And there's also some interesting things going on, and of course the vicinity with the U.S. also makes it the key player from the U.S. perspective. So we can talk a lot about Mexico if you guys are interested as well. So the bottom line for developed markets is that there's a resumption of growth. We're more optimistic on that side. Emerging markets are also growing more than they did last year, a pickup from 5.2 to 5.3. but it's not the very radical upgrade in the growth picture, and they are facing some structural difficulties going forward. They had a fantastic decade from, say, the early 2000s to the present, but that's going to be more difficult to attain. Those successes are going to be more difficult to attain going forward. So that ends those forecasts. Let me now move on to slides 4 and 5. What you see there is a famous measure that economists use often to describe the degree of slack in the economy. That is, what is the level difference of output, or GDP, with respect to where it could be, or with respect to potential. And that's what we call the output gap. What you see there is that at the world level, in EMs, which stands for emerging markets, and in DMs, which stands for developed markets, there is a negative output gap. What that means is that there is still a lot of spare capacity out there. There is still a lot of unused capital and unused labor that could be used or harnessed to generate output. And the economy is going to move gradually, say towards 2016, at least in emerging markets, back to closing that gap. And in the developed world, it's going to take a little longer to do that. This is a key variable to understand why is it, for example, that inflation has not picked up dramatically over the past couple of years, and we also don't have that harsh of a forecast with respect to the pickup in inflation. It's because we have a lot of slack in the economy. The other chart, slide number 5, shows potential growth for some key economies or key players in the global economy, and the growth rates from 2013 through 2014 in expectation. So what you see all the way to the right-hand side is obviously that China has the highest potential growth rate. It's an economy that has grown a lot and can still grow a lot. It's a different picture than it used to be in the 2000s. People used to think of China as an economy that could grow forever at the rate of 9 to 10%. 2013 was a year of coming to terms with the idea that China was slowing down a bit, but not radically. We were always of the view that these concerns of a crash landing were exaggerated. We think China can grow at a rate of between 7.5 and 8%, and that's pretty good for an economy of that gargantuan size. So for emerging markets, the growth... Yes, of course.
The question is, I would assume that the slowing down of growth depends upon how much they're paying that labor force, right? That's one part of it. Is that correct?
Well, to some extent, it depends on it does depend on that. What it depends mostly on is the model of growth. The previous model of growth used to be a model by which workers that were not in the actual workforce were, for example, brought into manufacturing activities and exporting activities, especially in the coast, from the mainland to the coast, and then shipping those things abroad. That's what brought China into the global stage and said, we're here to stay. The problem is that now the model has to change. They need to become much more human capital intensive, to develop their own technologies, to develop the human capital of their population and the education of their workers. So that's going to change. And as economies mature, those easy gains that are made at the beginning, as I said, by bringing workers from the mainland to the shore and engaging in manufacturing activities, get exhausted. So there are some diminishing returns to that labor accumulation, and there are also diminishing returns to the investment accumulation, to the capital accumulation. So growth now needs to come from productivity more than by the bumping up of the factors of production. That's a natural process that every economy goes through. And that's why in the U.S. we are expecting that 2.3% and not something closer to 5%, because the U.S. is a mature, well-developed economy. China is farther back in time. So
that's what I'm going to. I'm sorry. Just bear with me one quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we understand the United States. We understand the United States. We understand how we change governments, etc. There's a certain impenetrability of the Chinese system. We don't know. I mean, what would happen if the present government, if there was tremendous political activity in China? So how do you quantify the stability of China? I mean, it's one thing to look at the past. How do you project that to the future?
Absolutely. So I guess there are two things. One that we can quantify and one that we cannot quantify. The one that we cannot, let me start there, is precisely the degree of political instability or stability that can be expected to affect the economy. In the baseline case, we think that the current administration is going to be able to carry out these broad sweeping reforms that they've introduced. I mean, some people are comparing the reforms that they just unveiled at the end of last year with the reforms of 1978. So they're huge from the economic perspective. China is an economy that is moving from a centralized planning system to a system that's much more liberalized in every aspect of the economy, not only in labor, but also financial markets, in the FX. So that needs to happen gradually, and they're moving in that direction. Now, assuming or thinking that there's going to be enough political stability to carry out these reforms, we are then thinking that growth can park at a level of around 8% for the next few years without major hiccups, let's call it that way. Now, the part that we can quantify is how much these three basic elements of growth are going to contribute to generating output. And as I said, the three elements are labor. They're very good views that economists can form themselves because of the demographics. Demographic statistics are very stable. They don't change that radically. So we know how labor will evolve. Investment. We also know how much the new policies are going to bring in private versus the public investment and generate capital accumulation. And the third one is productivity. At the firm, we've done tons of work on something we call growth environment scores that, if time allows, I would love to describe, which is this metric that we have come with, which tries to rank countries according to their growth friendliness, like things that matter for growth: education, the political stability, the easiness of doing business, the macro picture, inflation, public debt.
Judicial system.
Judicial system, that's super important. It's in fact one of our 18 components is the rule of law that can be quantified. And so on the basis of all those metrics, we say, well, our best guess as to where China is heading in the next few years is at 7.5 to 8% growth. But it's, I mean, what you raised are key factors of this assumption. I mean, you definitely need to have a view of how much the politics will allow the economics to move in the direction that we're expecting.
Okay.
For sure. But it's also central, actually. I mean, that question is super pertinent because the discussion in markets at the time is, what are the possible things that might worry you? Well, I think a replay of the Great Depression is out of the picture. You don't read that in the newspapers anymore. What you read about, and you also don't read about the possible breakup of the Eurozone. You begin reading more about, well, what if things go wrong in China, right? Like, what if that big part of the big locomotor of growth of the global economy derails for whatever reason? And I think a lot of focus has gone into it, but the conclusion we come to is that things will be relatively okay. I can talk more about China because they also have a big credit stock. That's a problem. That they're highly levered, and engaging or engineering this deleveraging process is going to be super difficult. We still think in the baseline that they'll manage to do it. Also, there are some advantages to being a centralized economy, right? Which is that you can decontrol aspects of your economy gradually, step by step. And we think that the deleveraging process is going to be one area where that's going to play out.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then, of course, you've got the other countries there in the chart. Let me move on quickly to slide 6, which is, I call this the macro pentagon. You can't imagine how much trouble I went through for them. At Goldman, we have this very rigorous publication refereeing process that a content management group goes through every term that appears in a presentation. And Pentagon was a subject of discussion because obviously there's an institution called the Pentagon. But I argued that this was a geometric figure and that Euclid would agree with me that we could call it a pentagon, and they finally said that's all right. It's basically a summary of the macro picture with 5 important variables. One is the output gap that I just mentioned before. The other one is the inflation differential, how much pressure on the inflation side you've got. The current account differential, you may have heard of what's the size of the deficit between exports and imports. The fiscal deficit differential, which again is the difference in what comes in and what comes out on the fiscal side. And the growth differential, which is the difference in the rhythm, is what we were talking about before of that 3% versus the 2.3%. How faster or lower than trend growth are you growing? And so you plot that against the equilibrium, which is the gray line, the gray pentagon in the center, and what you can see is the different imbalances that are affecting these 2 big sides of the world. On the left-hand side, we've got developed economies. What are the problems of developed economies? Well, on the one hand, there's a lot of slack because the output gap has a blue line that's way below the gray line. There's not that much inflation problem. Current account is relatively okay. There are big fiscal deficits that come from the legacy of the crisis. The governments around the developed world try to support the economy by expanding on the deficit. And the growth differential is so-so. Economies, on average, growing at or below trend. Now, the problems on the emerging market side are very different. They're much closer to a capacity because the output gap is almost closed. The inflation differential is much worse than in developed economies because they have some inflation pressures to handle. The current account is also worse than it usually is. The fiscal side is so-so, and the growth differential is also so-so. So this gives you a flavor of what the problems are. In the developed world, it's mostly leverage of the public sector and some issues related to spare capacity. In the emerging market side, it's mainly inflation and relatively big current account deficits in some of the key players. Now let me discuss with some more detail the U.S. forecast. On slide 8, we've got what I like to call the crocodile chart. It's at least a crocodile mouth chart that compares two things. On the one side, the private sector financial balance, and on the other, the general government budget balance. So as you see, these basically move against each other. They have a negative correlation. What happened during the crisis, or after the onset of the crisis, was that the private sector went into this huge deleveraging effort. That is, the private sector balance shot upward. What happened on the public side was exactly the opposite, as governments try to support the economy by expanding on the deficit and some stimulus measures. Later on, the private sector has been very slow to come back to levels of leverage that are consistent with its historical levels. And on the public sector side, there's also been some delay of that deficit to close. It's been actually faster than we had anticipated before, but it's coming from a very deep level. So these two dynamics have crossed into generating a protracted recovery. In the old days, out of the crisis like we had in 2008, you would have expected that by 2009 or 2010 we would have been out of the woods already. This time around, because we come from a post-housing bust situation, the recovery has been much more prolonged. And these dynamics on both the private and the public side contribute to that. On slides 9 and 10, what we've got is two other reasons why we expect growth to pick up. The upper one shows the private and the public sector impulse. And I'll concentrate on the public sector impulse because it's one of the fundamental reasons why we're expecting growth to pick up. During 2013, we think that close to 150 basis points of growth were deducted by the fact that the government was closing on the deficit. That healing of the public sector side is what people refer to as a fiscal drag. How much of growth is the government taking away because it's engaging in a contractionary policy? This does not judge on the merits or the demerits of engaging in that correction, which may actually be called for when you have a level of debt of close to 110% of GDP. Eventually, you have to tighten the belt and do something to lower that stock of debt. The question is, at what pace do you do this? 2013 was relatively sharp, and it caused some mechanical contraction of growth beyond what it could have been. The good news for 2014 is that fiscal drag is declining. That is, the negative contribution to growth that's coming from the healing of the fiscal side and the correction of the deficit is smaller in 2014 than it was in 2013, and that's going to give a boost to the economy that's not negligible at all. Slide number 10 shows another aspect of this recovery, which is real consumer spending and real disposable income are moving basically one-to-one, and we're expecting a recovery over the course of this year. You see how deep they went in 2008 and 2009, but real disposable income has now finally stabilized at levels of close to 2.5%, which is it's a good relative growth that's going to also support the consumption and the investment side of the economy.
So is that level of growth is consistent with the level of inflation, or a little bit below it?
Yeah, let me talk about inflation, actually. I have a picture of inflation, but
can you talk about the sources of that growth? Is it going to come from a higher level of employment, higher wages, or from savings or incurring debt?
It's going to come from both, from all three reasons. It's going to come from relatively more employment because we're still expecting that the unemployment rate will decline, and hopefully not so much because the participation rate also declines, but because the participation rate eventually goes back to where it should be, but at the same time more jobs are created. So that's one. Real wages are finally stabilizing, as this chart shows. And then as the other chart showed, savings on the side of the private sector are coming down. So the level of deleveraging or the strength of that deleveraging effort is declining, and so people are more and more willing to go on to get a car loan or go on to get a durable goods consumption loan of some sort. That's on the demand side of loanable phones. People are becoming more interested in getting into leverage to purchase certain things, but also on the supply side. The supply so far has been pretty tight, and what we're expecting is that these bank loans are going to be relaxed going forward because obviously delinquencies and other measures of default are coming down because people's upper wages are going to be allowing them to pay their previous debts, or banks have to set aside less money as a cushion, and so they lend more. And it's a virtuous cycle that we're expecting will happen over the course of the year.
Would you repeat just for a second what you said about employment?
Yeah, so I actually have a chart on employment that if you hold on just maybe two minutes, I'll show you. Slide number 11 just repeats what I just said, in the sense that the personal savings rate, both the actual and the predicted is coming down towards 2015. So that, again, is a reflection of this deleveraging process coming to an end. The one below is our measure of CapEx expenditures, which are also one of the reasons why we expect growth to be relatively healthier this year than before, which is CapEx expenditures are increasing. You have there also non-residential fixed investment also stabilizing after years of turmoil. Another important factor, and I'll come to both the employment and the inflation picture in a second, but another important picture is the housing side of the story. As you know, in the U.S., housing prices declined by close to 35%. That's a massive decline in housing prices. It's seen very rarely. It has happened in other countries. It has happened in the U.S., but it's seen very rarely. That has a very negative impact on households' balance sheets. And, of course, their leverage position increases a lot if what they owe from their home is more than what the house is worth, which is a problem we're all familiar with. But fortunately, the housing market is showing some stabilization and some, green shoots of improvement. Housing starts, as you see in that chart 13, have begun to pick up. Part of the reason why they have picked up is because household formation has also increased, and demolitions, which is it's a measure of how much houses are turned over and rebuilt. Again, it's also picking up. Then the next slide, slide 14, refers to credit availability. We don't have to go into it in detail because I want to go through other slides, but it just reflects that same measure, that credit availability from the supply side is also picking up. Going
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Was the credit availability available a lot more years ago, which caused the housing market to go up, right?
Well, to some extent, I guess the lending standards were not at the... Ex post is easy to judge. I think we can do that judgment. That ex post, the lending standards were not reflective of the true risks of the underlying loans. I think that is a first statement.
I think they were reflective. I just think that it was ignored.
Well, either way, they weren't passing through to the actual real economy of these contracts of the mortgages and the other types of leverage related to housing. But I guess the situation after the crisis or with the crisis was the credit crunch bites both ways. It bites on the demand side because people just don't want to get into leverage anymore. Their household wealth has declined by a lot. And on the supply side, banks are also constrained, right? So banks are having all these non-performing loans all over the place, so they can't afford to expand on lending. And also lending is more difficult because people can't show up as collateral things that are eventually a guarantee that they'll be paid back. So that's a process that has to heal over the course of a few years, and we think that we're getting to the end of that healing process and that things can re-begin. That is, the demand side is picking up, the supply side is also expanding, so we hopefully will not have that big of an increase in the loans price, that is the price that is charged by banks, but we will also have an increase in the quantity that would spur up consumption and investment, two big components of GDP growth.
Okay. One more component to one of the difficulties to credit also was the banks not understanding or realizing what the regulatory requirements would also be, and so that was, another factor limiting freeing up credit as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that there are all these measures of economic uncertainty that people have put on the table. Some academics at Stanford have done it, and there are other equivalent measures. what these measures try to show is that in an environment that's more uncertain, it is difficult for businesses and households to commit to durable expenditures. And that just makes sense, even from a personal perspective. If you don't really know how the outlook is going to look like going forward, you better just hold on the sides. And they call this the wait-and-see mode. You just don't operate. You just don't engage in the decisions until the fog clears, like this morning that we had a lot of fog, right? You just need to wait until things stabilize. And that's one of the virtues of macro stability. People, especially in the emerging markets world, complain that there is too much emphasis on macro stability. Well, this is a reason. If you don't have stability, if you don't know what inflation is likely going to be in the next year, maybe, you don't have to give it with precision, but you need to basically know that it's going to be range-bound to some extent. You don't really engage in those decisions that you need to make. So definitely uncertainty was it was a big reason of the underlying delay in the recovery. Not only in the US, but also in other developed economies as well. Slide 15 shows this big downturn on the housing, on housing prices. At the moment, our model is consistent with the prices, roughly, so we have an estimate that's close to where the prices are. And going forward, we're expecting moderate increases in housing prices. If anything, the threat to the recovery of the housing sector will probably come from faster than expected rises or increases in mortgage rates. And that's a concern that I also have in the market side of the presentation, which is if there are things that worry us going forward, is a disorderly rise in rates, in interest rates, that might affect these mortgage markets and other the lending channel from monetary policy into the real economy. Now, I come finally to the inflation slide, on slide 16. As you see there, going forward, say the forecast goes to 2015, there's a range of the top 10 average, bottom 10 average of the forecasters. There is also a consensus forecast, and there is our own forecast. We have a U.S. economist, he's our chief economist named Jan Hatzius, who has a more benign view than consensus with respect to inflation. One of the reasons for that is, again, the big slack in the U.S. economy. It's slack both on the capacity side of the capital structure, but it's also slack on the labor market side, and I have a chart to show you that. So going forward, inflation is not expectedly going to pick up dramatically. There is I always like to bring up this analogy. There's a famous story, Sherlock Holmes, called Silver Blaze, and in that story there is this horse that disappears, and the jockey that was going to drive the horse the next day is killed. And so Sherlock Holmes comes into the picture and tries to solve the mystery. And so the first thing he asks when he looks around is whether the dog had done anything strange. And what the gatekeeper says is, no, the dog didn't even bark. And so Sherlock Holmes then says, oh, that was the interesting thing. And then he goes on to discover that it was a person that the dog knew, and blah, blah, blah. So he goes on to say that. But many people, and myself, have claimed that inflation is frankly the dog that didn't bark in this whole picture of the past 5 years that we've gone through, and it doesn't seem that it'll bark going forward. The reason for that is that we've seen unprecedented levels of monetary accommodation. Unconventional policies on the side of monetary policy that many people argue have been called for to save us from a replay of the Great Depression have also entailed a ballooning of the balance sheet of the central bank. And since Milton Friedman's times, everybody has known that inflation is, in the end, a monetary phenomenon. And the fact that inflation expectations are still so closely anchored to the 2% target for personal consumption expenditures inflation is actually surprising. But it's a reflection of two things. One, were you going to say something?
No, I was.
One is the credibility of the Fed that they have attained over the years, and the other one is that there is still a lot of slack in the economy. So inflation doesn't look like it's going anywhere, which would have been one of the concerns had you looked at this ballooning of the central bank's balance sheet. So it's a dog that didn't bark, and we don't expect it to bark a lot going forward. If anything, people are more worried about the deflationary scenario. And you may wonder, well, why would people be worried about declining prices? Well, Japan is a reason. So Japan has been trying to fight this for 20 years, and it's a very difficult trap to get out of. So you better try not to. Bernanke actually has a famous paper called Making Sure It Doesn't Happen Here, and by that he meant deflation, which is quite a ghost in economics.
One of the things I heard is the reason we don't really have inflation is because there is no wage inflation out there. Wages are staying low. So does that, in in your opinion, does that factor in?
That's definitely part of the story, yeah. So there is no contribution from very rapidly rising wages that you would have expected. In a big upturn on the economy, you would have expected that obviously labor, as labor supply increases, but labor demand also increases, the price of labor has to go up, so wages have to go up, and that puts upward pressure on margins and puts upward pressure on prices in the economy. So the whole thing goes up. What has happened is because of the slack in the labor market, there's been no big inflation pressure coming from wages, absolutely.
So you expect Yellen to allow inflation to increase, but very, very slowly?
And allow, I think it's a strong word, because central banks don't really allow inflation to do anything. It's inflation that allows them to react or not. But it's true in the sense.
You mean they don't determine the policy?
Yeah, when they determine the policy in accordance to the evolution of, it's an endogenous process. They do something, inflation reacts. Inflation does something, they react. So it's difficult to disentangle the two, but
so like the intervention you were saying has kept it down by the Fed, right?
No, actually, so I think the Fed's actions in another scenario would have brought it upwards. But the fact is that the Fed is fighting the deflationary pressures that come from a lot of slack in the economy. It was a big, deep recession that we went through. The dislocation of the production factors that's reflected in the lack of employment advancing a lot in spite of the recent print that we got is also reflective of that same problem. So it's more of the Fed's job is to try to make sure that the economy revives, at the same time avoiding a replay of the Great Depression, which would have been possible if you were standing here in this table. Like I remember the research that I was doing back then in 2008, we had probabilities of a Great Depression of something close to 30%, which were pretty big. I mean, given the severity of the scenario, avoiding that type of outcome was super important. And we think that the Fed managed to do that by ballooning the balance sheet and basically flooding the market with the liquidity that they did. That saved us from the Great Depression. Of course, it may have had some costs. Are we good in time?
Yeah, I think so.
Please let us know when you want us to stop. But so the Fed, the Yellen Fed, is going to be very similar to the Bernanke Fed in the sense that they don't see inflation as a big threat for now, at least, and they prefer to privilege the other side of their mandate, which has to do with bringing employment back to full employment levels. And that has to do with allowing the economy to recover without choking off that recovery, which has happened before, by the way, and in other central banks as well. As soon as the recovery picks up, central banks begin to tighten again, and then the recovery is just a false start. But given the whole effort that the Fed board has done over the recent years in trying to convey to markets the idea that they're going to be very lenient until they see either inflation picking up dramatically, which we don't see happening, or actual the labor market coming back to more stable, historically consistent levels, we think they're going to.
I think, Jose, what Doug was referring to might be that Janet Yellen, now the Fed chairman, is going to slowly stop buying back the $75 billion every month, and will very carefully do that so that you don't see this dramatic increase in inflation if the economy comes roaring back. I mean, she's going to balance that. I think that's...
No, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely right. It's a tricky balancing process for the Fed, because on the one hand, there is a concern. Well, if I don't begin withdrawing the support at the measured pace, then inflation is going to skyrocket at some point because growth is picking up. On the other side, you also don't want to withdraw that support too quickly because the recovery is still fragile. I mean, one week we get good prints, the other week we get not that good prints, the other week we get good prints, and so on. So we're still not in an environment that we're that confident that the Fed can withdraw the whole support. Now, the other advantage of the current scenario is that it's become relatively clear that the Fed has various tools at its disposal. They have the asset purchases, which is what you just referred to, that it's the easiest to withdraw because it also came last, right? So they first went on to lowering the rates to basically zero, and then they engaged in the unconventional policies. And they're rolling them back in the reverse order they came in. So it makes sense to withdraw that additional support, which, by the way, it's just a reduction in the rhythm of accumulation of support. It doesn't even mean that they're going to begin withdrawing the support, because all they're doing is they're reducing the amount of purchases they carry out every month. But they're still purchasing stuff, right? So we're expecting that process to end. I have a chart to show you that it's, maybe we should move on to it. It's actually on slide 18. We expect that QE3 will likely end in late 2014. So these are the changes to Fed securities holdings per month. So that just shows you the rate of decline that we're expecting. So we're expecting that to be basically finished by the course of the end of this year. And then on to 2015 and 16, you begin seeing them even getting rid of those securities that they purchased. But that comes farther back. Now, the other thing that I think Bernanke was very clear in stressing was we have another tool. That other tool is called the actual federal funds rate, which is the actual interest rate. But we're not planning on raising that anytime soon. I mean, they really are going to wait until they're able to say the economy is standing on its feet. And I actually have the next slide, slide 19, shows that's the expected path for the federal funds rate. Consensus, again, is expecting the first hike to come at the end of 2015, which is already a year and a half from now. We're expecting it to happen even later than that, probably around the first quarter of 2016. And again, the reason is, on the one hand, this conviction that the board and Yellen will be very accommodative as long as they don't see inflation picking up substantially. And on the other, the fact that there is still a lot of slack in the economy. So if you believe that there's still a lot of spare capacity, then you need to believe that in order to close it, it'll take some time and they won't hike until that time. Now, this brings me to an interesting debate that you may have heard of, which is the debate of a potential secular slowdown. Larry Summers, who used to be president of Harvard, also Secretary of the Treasury, and then worked with the Obama administration for a bit, has come up with this speech that he gave at the IMF, talking about the potential secular stagnation of the U.S. economy. And by that, he meant that probably growth is not even going to be at the 2.3%, but it's going to be much lower than that, because he claims that maybe the baby boomers retiring are going to deduct some labor component, and maybe productivity will also decline. And that goes in line with theories that people have said before him. Albin Hansen, back in the 1930s, also called for a secular stagnation. Fortunately, it did not materialize, because then we got the roaring 40s and 50s and 60s, which were years of tremendous growth. But now he's claiming that that might happen again. So the discussion is, what is the potential growth rate of the U.S. economy? Do you believe in the 2.3 that I just said, or do you think it's even lower than that? And that's the kind of debate that economists get lost in, and we're going to probably spend the next year or two arguing about it. But we're of the view that not that persistent damage was done after the crisis to the potential growth rate of the economy. And if that's true, there's still a lot of slack, because we can still aspire to grow faster, and thus the Fed is not going to hike sooner than you would anticipate. If you came to this table and said, I know for a fact that potential growth in the U.S. should be at close to 1.8, then that changes the picture. Because in that case, the tightening should come earlier, because you'll reach capacity constraints much earlier than you would have anticipated. So that's the overall picture from the U.S. There's also a table with our forecasts in more detail on page number 20. And let me just give you, if you like, the offshoots, if we have time to give you the offshoots of other places of the world. The situation in Europe, as illustrated on slide 21, is one where fiscal relief is also coming. As you know, I guess the U.S. And the U.K. were ahead in some of the adjustments, but they were also later in another adjustment. So in the euro area, 2012, as you see there, was a year of the harshest, say, contraction or fiscal drag coming from their adjustment. Then 2013 was smaller than that, and we're expecting that 2014 will be probably the lowest fiscal drag in the past 5 years or so. That's a positive news for the economy. Again, this does not pass a judgment on the need to carry out these adjustments. Frankly, if you ask me, both in Europe and in the US, the stock of debt is too high, and eventually it'll need to be closed somehow. The question is when, and whether you do it in a situation where the economy is still fragile, or whether you do it in a situation where the economy is growing faster. But these very high levels of debt eventually bite on potential growth because they entail a crowding out of some of the resources that are having to be channeled towards financing the public sector as opposed to financing private enterprise. So it's kind of like it's a difficult balancing act to withdraw or to cure or to lower that stock of debt while you're actually trying to support the economy. But Europe is in the middle of that in the middle of that problem. People used to think of Europe as a source of tail risk. You may have heard of this black swan story, the kind of things that happen infrequently but with severe consequences. The potential breakup of the euro area with the Greek troubles and the troubles in Spain and Italy was a big ghost that was hanging over the course of 2013. We don't expect that that will be the case in 2014 because they're recovering in growth and they're engaging in some of these adjustments. Unfortunately, markets have also begun soothing or alleviating some of the pressure that they were putting on some of these governments. For example, in Italy and Spain, the yields at some point went all the way to 7. That's much higher than emerging markets pay. So that's just a reflection of how risky markets eventually perceived these countries to be. Nowadays, the yields have come down by a lot, closer to 3%.
So have we undershot the other way? I mean, the European stock market was up a lot last year. Maybe it shouldn't have been up as much as it was, but so are we going to go back the other way because now we've overshot?
No, I think, our view is basically that there is some pricing of this risk that wasn't there before. You can look at, for example, a great indicator that I like to point at is if you look at the spread between the yields paid by the sovereign debt in Italy and Germany over the course of this honeymoon period of the euro area, which was, say, up to the early 2000s, that was basically flat. There was no spread at all. It's close to 0%. That must have meant that they were equally risky. As it turned out, they were not equally risky. So after the crisis, there was an overshooting of that spread that went all the way to 7, as I said, and now it's parked at around maybe 2-ish %. Is the new level more consistent with the actual, does it better reflect the pricing of risk? We think so. Will it go all the way to 0 again? Very unlikely. Because, markets do forget, but they don't forget that quickly. So maybe you have, there's this famous book by Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff, who are professors at Harvard, called This Time is Different. And what they're referring to is this syndrome that people, every time there is a crisis, say, yeah, but this time is different than before. And frankly, if you look at them from the very very historical perspective and also in the cross-section, it's always a very similar picture. It's a big leveraging that comes in, that there's a bubble forming somewhere. Then someone begins to think, prices have gone too far. Let's think it over. And then the whole thing unravels, and then there's a protracted recovery as the economy first deleverages and then goes back to leveraging. And then by the next time, people will have forgotten. But we think we're too close to that. So markets are still remembering the events, and we think that it's unlikely that the pricing will go that far. Now, the problem of the alleviation is on another side. It's more on the political side. At the time when you have yields at 7%, it's much harder for governments to refuse to engage in the adjustments they need to make. Say, pension reform is a best example. So sometimes converting the systems into defined contributions as opposed to defined benefits, or changing the retirement age, or doing some of the things that will guarantee fiscal sustainability for some of these European economies, it was easier to pressure Congresses and governments to do it when the yields were so high than where they are now. So there's a political economy argument of how much you can actually harness market pressure to carry out some of the reforms that are important. And some of those chances are gone in Europe, and that will be the test for the next couple of years, how much they can advance on that agenda.
Did you say when it's high, it's harder to make changes than when it's low?
No, the opposite. When it's high, because governments need to finance their expenditures, and so going into the market and paying the market 7 to 8% in interest for the debt that you're picking up eventually will be unsustainable. So that forces you to go back to Congress and say, we need to agree on these adjustments that are going to make markets perceive us to be safer than we are currently perceived to be, so that yields come down and I can finance and roll over my expenditures in a healthier way, in a sustainable way. But when that pressure alleviates, then the incentives for governments to go through these painful decisions, because they're usually very painful decisions, socially very difficult to explain, and then you have demonstrations in the street and the like. So carrying out reforms agendas, it's never easy, but it's relatively easier when you have some market pressure. Of course, there's a lot of pain involved. I mean, some people have claimed that crises are the best opportunity for reform, but it's a very costly opportunity, right? So you would have preferred to get there without the cost of having gone through a crisis, but it oftentimes doesn't work that way. And then let me show you slide number 23, which is the case of Japan. Japan is moving in the opposite direction from the perspective of the fiscal drag. Because they're raising the value-added tax in the first quarter or second quarter of this year, closer to April, and that's going to cause an expansion, as you can see in 2014, of the fiscal drag. So the government will have a negative contribution to growth. That said, you may have heard of this Abenomics. Abe is the prime minister, and there's an emphasis on the central bank supplying a lot of liquidity. I said before that the Fed had ballooned the balance sheet of the central bank here in the U.S., its own balance sheet. In Japan, it has been even higher than that. It's gone to almost 18% of GDP. In the U.S., it's at close to 12% of GDP. So the monetary effort in Japan is massive. And the new leadership at the central bank, Governor Kuroda, has been also very unconventional with respect to the policies. Central banks are fantastic. They have a fantastic warehouse of weapons to use in the market. Sometimes they're scared to use them because they can have consequences, and there can have consequences either in inflation or in markets not understanding. But in Japan, there have been some more cautious than now in order to convince markets that they were going to generate the conditions that will bump up inflation. They have the opposite problem as most places, right? So what they need to do is to jumpstart inflation to levels of closer to 2%.
So, but if that were just perception, the stock market was up 50%.
The stock market is a lot.
That's really good perception.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a repricing of all assets, yeah. And I guess the stock market, you can always decompose stock market returns into two things. One is, well, how much do I pay there is this famous economic model of thinking of the stock market as a tree that gives you fruit. So this tree sometimes can go into a very bad period of a crash. And so you can think of that as a flood or a lightning bolt that hits a tree and destroys it. So in order for you to hold a claim on that tree, which is basically what you hold when you hold stock of a company, you demand a premium because there is a risk that something like that will happen. So that's one side of the price of stocks. The other side of the story is, well, this is a good tree that actually gives me a lot of fruit. So I like it because the returns on my ownership of that little chunk of that tree is giving me dividends. So you have the two components of it. You're asking for a protection against a big decline in the asset, so you're asking for a higher rate of return, but you're also paying for a tree that gives you dividends. And that's what has happened in Japan. There's a repricing of the assets because people believe that growth will be better going forward, and that there's a lot of liquidity in the system coming from the central bank that's going to have to end up somewhere, and most likely it's going to end up in the stock market financing the activities of different companies in Japan. So that has brought up the stock market. And then on the exchange side, on the exchange rate side, what's happened is there's this big push for the administration to generate inflation. Part of that translates into a weaker yen, and the weaker yen is also benefiting some exporters, obviously. And so that has been more of an uphill battle than people thought, and now people are focused on March and April when they introduce the value-added tax. We're also expecting monetary policy to also implement some measures. We still don't obviously know what this will be, but they will need to try to convince markets that they're very firm on the strategy that they announced in 2013.
So when do you think it's fair to say that what Abe did worked?
I guess by the end of this year, it's a fair judgment because you will have had at least 2 years of growth to look at. You will also have seen how inflation picked up or not. It's been weird because at the beginning, what you really want to say jolt again or to shake is inflation expectations, because that's what's really sticky. If I know that prices are going to decline going forward in a deflationary environment, this is a true trick. I will not buy stuff because I might get it cheaper later, right? So why would I buy it? But if I don't buy stuff, then there's no production because no one will produce anything that I won't buy. And there's no consumption and there's also no investment. The opposite incentives happen when you have a healthily inflating economy where prices go up because you better buy it now because you'll get it more expensive. Not a lot, but more expensive in the future. So the core is to see how those inflation expectations have changed. Unfortunately, in Japan, these TIPS markets, which are the inflation-protected securities markets, are not that well developed or not that liquid. So it's hard to extract inflation expectation from them. There are also some surveys that they ask economists, what do you think of inflation? But they're usually based on other market metrics. So when we see the reality over the course of this year, when we see that announcement in March and April of how committed they are to that goal of raising inflation expectations, I think that's when you can pass a fair judgment on the situation with other policies. Let me summarize the view on the emerging market side, because I know that that's not central to your interest, but it is important from the global side's perspective. And I'll just show you this one chart from that section. Slide 25 is a slide that shows the differential in growth of emerging economies versus developed markets. So as you saw over the course of the crisis, obviously, that differential expanded by a lot because developed economies it's slide 25. If developed economies were contracting and emerging economies were growing and still booming back in that time. Since then, emerging economies, as I showed you, have somewhat slowed down, some of them because of this organic process of the evolution of those countries, some of them also because they faced important challenges, and they have that differential with respect to developed economies has roughly stabilized at that around 3%. Now, the way we look at emerging economies is very structural. Emerging economies benefited over the course of the 2000s from various factors. On the one hand, the terms of trade. The stuff that they sold abroad rose in prices, and that's always good if you're shipping out commodities, for example. So that was one. China's ascent to the global, scenario also helped them. Its entrance to the WTO and its expansion of trade worldwide were also fueling growth domestically and for the emerging markets that are connected to China, like Brazil is one of them. Inflation was also controlled, so they brought inflation down from 15% to 5%. The levels of leverage also declined a lot in emerging markets after the crisis of the 1990s. You may remember the tequila crisis, the samba crisis, the Russian crisis, the Asian crisis. All those crises eventually forced countries to engage in deep reforms, mostly going onto the liberalization of their economies, and that put them in a good place. And the fifth element was this long-run decline of yields in the developed world, in the U.S. in particular, made it for very easy financing conditions abroad for emerging markets. Now, all of the things that I just said are either going to be rolled back or have reached a level that can't improve much farther going forward. Especially the declining yields in the U.S. We're expecting the exact opposite. We're expecting yields to pick up gradually, but they're going to pick up. So the financing conditions are going to be tighter for EMs, emerging markets, than they used to be before. And all the other benefits, they kind of like reach a plateau. So from now on, and the way I like to think of emerging markets is like there are little boats in this bay. It's a gigantic bay that has two big players. One is China, the other one is the U.S. And you can think of Europe as a third one, as a block. But so there are these big cruises floating in the bay, and emerging markets are frankly relatively smaller economies. Even Mexico is only at 2% of the global economy, so it's not large. And they're subject to these big waves that come from the big cruise ships that are moving in given directions. Because a cruise ship called U.S. is moving to higher rates environment, that's going to prove challenging from some of these little boats, especially those that were not in that good standing before. That is, if your level of leverage was very high, big fiscal deficits, big current account deficits, financing that as the world moves to a higher interest rate environment in developed economies is going to be very hard. So it's a challenging picture, and we've come with this mantra of nowadays, what matters for emerging markets is just like in the real estate, you have location, location, location. What matters now from the perspective of emerging markets is differentiation, differentiation, differentiation. They're very different. And some of them are moving in the right direction, some of them are not. Some of them are connected to the big boats that are going to grow. Some of them are not. Mexico and Brazil is a perfect example. Mexico is connected to the U.S. Brazil is connected to China. China is slowing down. The U.S. is picking up. who do you prefer to be connected to? Obviously the U.S., but that's it's a historical accident and geographical accident. So you better engage in the policies that allow that internal rebalancing and, again, to generate productivity growth, which is the most important thing. Now let me move on to the markets side. If you move on to slide 29. Yeah. I can wrap up with this in 2 minutes, and then we have space for any questions you guys may have. So these are our market themes for the year. It's basically, and I'll go through one by one because it's important. So the first one is a showtime for the U.S. developed markets recovery. We've talked about it. It's a pickup in growth in the U.S. and developed countries. Let's see if it materializes.
Do you think that's priced into the equity markets? Because you've got essentially a 50% increase in GDP growth in the U.S. forecast. Where was your forecast at the beginning of last year, and where did we end up?
So I think our forecast was higher than we ended up because the fiscal drag ended up being bigger than we thought at the beginning of the year. So part of the growth upgrade is definitely reflected in equity markets. We still think that for this year we can get some decent, say, 7 or 8% returns. It's not going to be the 30% of last year, which was coming from a very low base. But the upgrade in the growth views is to some extent priced, but still not entirely priced. There is still some skepticism with respect to the true pickup in growth. And always, as always, like it is surprises that markets reward, and the possible surprise that eventually growth does materialize at a rate of 3% is something that's going to be rewarded in equity markets, and probably with a 7%, 8% return. But that's definitely.
And if the data points that you get over the next, say, 3 to 6 months come in below expectations, then you would expect a repricing in the private equity market?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, markets are pretty quick to react, and if anything, you can also make the claim that markets, to some extent, because of the argument you just said, they begin to price in outcomes before they happen. Because they aggregate information. That's the magic of markets. It's information from individual people that in the end aggregate into reflecting one SPX level at a given point in time, and that there's a lot of information of what people perceive in that single number. The second point is forward guidance is harder in an above-trend world. What that means is that the Yellen Fed, the Kuroda Bank of Japan, the Draghi European Central Bank will find it harder to manage expectations when growth is picking up, because people will accelerate and say, oh my God, we're actually growing much faster. Maybe they're going to hike sooner. So managing that balance is going to be difficult. The third one is earn the developed market equity risk premium. Again, we favor equity markets in the developed world. Hedge the risk somehow. So you need to basically try to find other places in the asset spectrum that will provide you a hedge against the potential downturn of that may come from the disappointment in growth. Good carry, bad carry. There are places where it makes sense to go into a high interest rate currency or not. The race to the exit kicks off. By that we mean central banks are all in the easing mode, but eventually they're going to have to roll it back. So the question is who will go first and how that first player that goes out is going to affect the rest. Obviously, there are big players. Again, these 3 big central banks are the key to watch, but there are other minor or smaller central banks to also keep an eye on. Decision time for the high flyers, that usually refers to places where housing prices have risen too much. Even after the downturn in prices, there are some other places in the world, Canada, Israel, are examples where housing prices have continued to grow, and it's important to keep an eye on them because they may be overheating in their housing prices. Still not your older brother emerging markets. That just refers to this song that emerging markets are different than they used to be in the early 2000s. EM differentiation to continue. I also stress that it's no longer advisable to see them as a block. Commodity downside risks grow. We think that oil prices are going to be pretty well behaved. The shale revolution has a lot to do with that. Like, we're expecting stable oil prices and even declining oil prices going forward. That's fantastic news from the global economy's perspective, but not fantastic news for the exporters of that oil, right? Because you sell it. And stable China may be good enough. That is, China growing at a 7.5 or 8% is pretty good as long as it doesn't fall into a trap or a crisis. We're happy with that. So that would wrap up the views. That is, solid growth going forward, interesting asset market opportunities, especially in the developed world, emerging markets, some good, some less good stories, and overall a pickup in growth conditions going forward. I would wrap up with that. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to stay as long as you guys want to discuss them.
Any questions?
Thank you very much.
We're out of metaphors.
Thank you.
Well, one quick note is SEMA and her whole team has access to a lot of what Jose's team puts out. So if you want any Outlook pieces, either at the beginning of the year or any point after there's an event, you want to reach out, you have access to that, but also we can direct you on specific pieces if it's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Seema, I don't think that we're going into executive session at all today, right?
We do need to, just for a minute.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah. So that's all we had for the public session.
Okay, so we need a motion to move out of public session into executive session.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Any objections? Hearing none, the motion carries. So we're now in executive session. The cameras should go off.